Okay, hello and welcome to the second presentation in our faculty graduate student colloquium series of this semester. Today we have a presentation from Professor Lorenzo Simpson, and West Poindexter student here will be commenting afterwards. The topic for today's talk is hermeneutics as critique, science, politics, race, and culture. We will be hearing from, as I said, Professor Lorenzo Simpson, who is a professor of philosophy here at Stony Brook. He is the author of 3 books. The first called Technology, Time, and the Conversations of Modernity. The second, The Unfinished Project Toward a Post-Metaphysical Humanism. And the third, we will be hearing about today, is hermeneutics as critique. And he's currently working on a new project in the philosophy of aesthetics on Duke Ellington's compositional practice. Professor Simpson will speak for about 45 minutes. It will be followed by a commentary from West, who is a second-year philosophy student in the philosophy department, specializing in hermeneutics. Well, I'll turn it over now to Professor Simpson. Thank you.
Behind the curtain. Okay, well, imagine in a galaxy long ago, far away, there lived 2 strikingly different tribes. When stumbling across an unfamiliar object, members of one tribe, let's call them the Angles, right, picked it up, squinting in the light, examined it, tried to determine its intrinsic properties through measurement, weighing, and eventually chemical analysis and so on, ultimately attempting to develop precise criteria for distinguishing it in a univocal way, a lump of one kind of stuff from a lump of another kind of stuff. And for distinguishing in, again, a univocal way, a genuine instance of a particular kind of stuff from a mere pretender. And the Angles developed ever more excellent tools and techniques for doing this. When members of the other tribe, let's call them the Frankendorches, when they happened upon an unfamiliar object, they tended to leave it in place, carefully examining its context, its connections, relationship to and lines of affinity with the other stuff in its environment, perhaps attempting to imagine how its appearance would be transformed if its environment were altered. They would try to determine its genealogy, its history, the forces that led to its production, and so on. They might even ask about their own role in comprising its context. And they, the Frankendorches, became increasingly subtle in these sorts of investigation. The questions they raised about the objects of their encounters would generally take the form, how does it fit in? Whereas the Angles would more typically ask, what kind of a thing is it? And they went on in these typical and distinctive ways until the time came that they had to flee their galaxy in an attempt to escape a great cosmic conflagration. Now, the lineal descendants of the first tribe ended up colonizing and settling in England, North America, and Australia. And they bore names like Eyre, Sellers, Donnellan, Kripke, McDowell, and Dennett. The descendants of the second settled for the most part in parts of France and Germany, and some in Italy. And bore names like Heidegger, Sartre, Irigaray, Fatima, Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze. With rare exceptions, the descendants of the Angles and the Frankendorches had been unable to talk to each other about anything of importance. Until there somehow emerged a child of hybrid lineage who, though disowned by both branches of his family, issued Rodney King-like appeals for them to just get along. Now, this child, who grew up to be Richard Rorty, dreamed of a grand conversation in which the Angles, so preoccupied with their lumps, and the Frankendorches, with their talk of texts and contexts, could face each other as respectful interlocutors and try to see themselves as occupying positions on a sliding scale differing by degree, rather than as fixed points on different sides of a non-negotiable divide. Now, many, if not most, of the recent attempts to bridge this divide have assumed that the bridge is a one-way thoroughfare, whereby tools imported from the so-called analytic side are conveyed to the other so-called continental side of the divide to repair the potholes discovered on the continental side of the divide. And one of my aims in this book was to present a case where resources that are indigenous to continental habits of mind may shed light on some analytic roadblocks, have traffic moving in the other direction. A prime example of which is the issue, say, of incommensurability as it has arisen in the philosophy of science. The other and overarching aim of the book was to deliver on Hans-Georg Gadamer's claims for the universality of philosophical hermeneutics. These are claims which, I should say, I don't think Gadamer himself ever fully redeemed. Now, hermeneutics as a disciplinary practice first emerged to meet the demands of textual exegesis, especially the exegesis of biblical texts. Later, in the 19th century, in the hands of thinkers such as Schleiermacher and Dilthey, it was developed as an alternative to the explanatory model of the natural sciences for rendering an account of human speech and action. By the mid-20th century, and in a way that was mediated by post-Hegelian historicism, as well as Martin Heidegger's account of understanding, that is of Verstehen, Gadamer developed a general philosophical hermeneutics that emphasized the significant constitutive role that language plays in understanding. Having been born from a concern to decipher truths that were jealously guarded by sacred texts, hermeneutics was long loath to traffic in worldly concerns such as those of science, politics, cultural critique, and race. So my book aims to steer philosophical hermeneutics along paths not typically tread, and does so by developing a hermeneutics with critical intent, one that demonstrates the ongoing relevance of hermeneutic approaches to matters that are far beyond the field of literary and textual analysis, to which, with few exceptions, such strategies have traditionally been restricted. In extending the hermeneutic investigations begun in my earlier books, which were mentioned, Technology, Time, The Conversations of Modernity, and The Unfinished Project, here in this book, I deploy the resources of hermeneutics to respond to the commonly voiced charges against it, namely that is a relativistic and it is critically impotent. So I want to respond to those charges that are typically lodged against it. And I do so with respect to matters of scientific theory choice, racial politics, and the politics of cultural identity. Thus, I admit placing a rather large target on my back, covering so many topics. So let me be clear about the conception of hermeneutics that informs the book. In addition to a hermeneutical conception of language, which I oppose to a designative or directly referential account of language, very roughly the view that's developed earlier by John Stuart Mill and later by Saul Crickby, Ruth Marcus, et cetera. In addition to that, there are three basic hermeneutical concepts that are central to my argument and that are deployed throughout the book, with modifications and alterations where appropriate. They are the following. One, Gadamer's account of the dialectical logic of question and answer. Two, Gadamer's essentially Aristotelian account of concept formation. Three, the idea of a hermeneutic horizon. And four, the idea of fusion of horizons, the possible fusion of horizons. So just a brief comment on each from the outset. On number one, dialectical question and answer. Gadamer appropriates from the British philosopher R.G. Collingwood the conviction that in order to understand the meaning of a text or utterance, we need to have a sense of the question to which the text or utterance is an answer or a response. On two, concept formation. And this is my own sort of formulation of what Gadamer takes from Aristotle's posterior analytics. In order to bring order, if we're to bring order and coherence to the indeterminacy of experience, as William James says, just one damn thing after another, if we're going to bring order and coherence to the indeterminacy of experience, to its indefinite plurality, we need to devise some way of partitioning or segmenting reality into a limited number of groups of things, in such a way that things in a group have more in common with or are more similar to each other than they do with things in other groups. So we always then attempt to achieve maximum similarity among things within a group or category and maximum difference between groups, right? That's through this strategy. But here's the problem with that strategy. Everything is similar to everything else in some sense, and everything is different from everything else in some sense. So we need some idea of what would be irrelevant similarity or irrelevant difference. So this means then that sameness versus difference, like kind versus degree, are really sliding signifiers, and that their application has to be understood to be relative to both what I'm going to call altitude, which is determined by how granular we want our representations to be, and attitude, which refers to the interests or concerns that occasion our demand for such a representation. This means then that the application of the concepts of similarity and difference really presupposes a three-place relationship. That is, X is similar or dissimilar to Y in virtue of some property or relation Z. So we have to then attend to the metric of similarity, Z, which has arisen to salience as a result of the interests, purposes, or projects at hand. So things are similar or different to each other with respect to some property that they have, which is determined by the projects that one has in attending to them. On numbers 3 and 4, horizons and fusion of horizons. A hermeneutic horizon can be thought of as a matrix of intelligibility that projects what I call a local ontology, which marks out the sorts of entities that can be meaningfully referred to, as well as the properties that can be meaningfully predicated of them. And on the 4, a fusion of horizons is a commiseration of such matrices. I now turn to an overview of the main arguments of the book, and I'll sort of go through it as succinctly as I can, but still trying to give you some sense of the flavor of them. First chapter of the book is devoted to a hermeneutic account of scientific theory choice. The second is devoted to a hermeneutic account of social and cultural critique. The third provides a hermeneutic account of agency, one with implications for social policy, insofar as it pertains to matters of race and poverty. The fourth chapter revisits the issue of the biological status of race in the wake of recent findings in the fields of genomics and population genetics. In the final concluding chapter, I explore the normative implications of my arguments and highlight its relationship to the Frankfurt tradition of critical theory, in particular to its first and second generations represented by Adorno and Habermas, respectively. So I begin in the first chapter entitled Twin Earth and Its Horizons on Hermeneutics, Reference, and Scientific Theory Choice. And I begin on ground that is often regarded as the least hospitable to hermeneutics, namely science. In this chapter, devoted largely to an extensive account of the implications of the hermeneutic conception of language, I lay the groundwork for hermeneutic rejoinders to the epistemological challenges of relativism and incommensurability it seems to provoke. Further, I demonstrate how a critical hermeneutics can accommodate the ideas of both rational theory choice, having reasons for choosing one theory over another, and the plausibility of understanding scientific change as a reflection of progressive learning processes. Now, here's the argument in a nutshell in the first chapter. Fundamental to philosophical hermeneutics, as developed by Gadamer, is what can be called a constitutive view of language. A view inspired by the later Heidegger, who pithily summed it up with the phrase, "Language is the house of being." More specifically, the hermeneutic approach to language is held to entail two theses. One, that the meaning of a term or expression determines its reference. That is, determines what the term or the expression picks out or denotes. And two, that the meaning of an expression is determined by the role it plays in the network of which it is an element. This is a version of semantic holism. Basically, this second thesis that the meaning of a term is determined by the role it plays in a network, that's roughly equivalent to an acknowledgement of the role played by difference in the structuralist accounts of language, etc. When a given expression is circulated in different systems or networks, its meaning and consequently its reference changes as well. Accordingly, this claim that the hermeneutic account of meaning can do justice neither to the possibility of communication across such networks, because they'll be talking past each other, talking about different things, nor to a non-question begging critical comparison of competing networks. Examples of such competing networks would be, say, Kuhnian paradigms, or perhaps Foucauldian epistemes. As a result, hermeneutics is claimed to lack the resources necessary to represent science as a rationally progressive enterprise. Some version of a theory of direct reference, this is where Mill and Kripke come in, or early Hilary Putnam come in. They claim that some version of a theory of direct reference is required to address these lacunae. I assess this claim that we need direct reference to make sense of science in a way, and argue that hermeneutics does indeed possess the requisite resources to address these concerns. And incidentally, the theories of direct reference themselves are unable to escape the hermeneutic circle, that they have an ineliminable hermeneutic moment or dimension. I argue here that the determination of the reference of scientific terms always takes place within and depends upon a taken for granted local ontology, the kinds of things that scientists take to intelligibly exist and the kinds of properties that can be intelligibly predicated of those things. In other words, the determination of the reference takes place within a matrix of intelligibility that is contextually indexed to the aims of science, to the project of science. The aims of explanation and prediction are fundamental to these contexts within which natural science is practiced. So the so-called natural kind terms of science, terms such as chemical elements, biological species, chemical properties, physical properties. The so-called natural kind terms of science, I argue, refer to entities and classes of entities under descriptions that are, at a given stage in the development of a particular science, believed to be explanatorily relevant. That's the project. And the matrix of intelligibility is, in a sense, projected in terms of that project. Right? Hence, such terms should not be understood to refer, as theorists of direct reference claim, and other positivist epistemologists claim, those terms cannot be understood to refer to fully determinate structures that have an independently existing metaphysical status. Natural kind terms basically then should be understood as kind of constructs which refer to basic explanatory primitives. That's to say, the primitives that are taken to have the greatest salience at a given stage in the development of a particular science. Accordingly, such structures are perhaps to be understood as artifacts that can enjoy no metaphysical necessity that is wholly independent of our beliefs. Here, I find myself in agreement with Richard Rorty's critique of such externalist theories of meaning. It is absurd, I claim, to think of the scientific community as a community of interpreters that has reached a revisable consensus on the meaning of the terms that refer to its fundamental structures. This notwithstanding, and here I part company with Rorty, I show that many of the distinctions that are held to be salient for an account of science as a rational progressive enterprise can nevertheless be retained in a hermeneutic analysis if they are suitably reframed. For instance, by attending to the hermeneutic distinction between meanings that are associated with a shared matrix of intelligibility versus those that are not, we can retain the observational term, theoretical term distinction that is traditionally invoked by philosophers of science. And we can do so in a way that we, using the resources of hermeneutics alone, can make it intelligible that observations, empirical observations, can be dispositive in adjudicating between competing theoretical claims, thus allowing us to retain the idea that scientific change can be rationally motivated, even if, as my former teacher Norbert Hansen famously insisted, data is always theory-laden. The hermeneutic view that there can be no linguistically innocent experience, by no means implies that there cannot be network or paradigm invariant experience. To briefly illustrate this point with regard to just an example from, I think a fairly quickly accessible example from celestial mechanics, when asked to describe the motion of the planet Mercury as it traverses its solar orbit, adherents of both sort of classical Newtonian physics and of Einstein's general theory of relativity, though those theories respectively project different representations of the universe, but members of both camps would, when asked, what do you see there, they would describe the trajectory of Mercury in precisely, more or less precisely the same terms. So they would share an observational experience, even if they don't share theoretical commitments. So just as a quick, I'm supposed to touch it or, oh no. Oh, okay.
That's all right.
The former physicist who is really a technophobe Luddite. All right, so this, okay. Basically what I'm trying to do here is here's metaphysical realism. There's reality, we got these theories, reality is what it is, reality determines which theory is right, which theory is wrong. Here's relativism. Our theories or our languages project a domain. Here, different theories project different domains. They're talking past each other. What I've tried to do in this chapter, in this sort of in a dialectical way, I end up with this Rube Goldberg contraption here. This is my position, is to retain the aim of metaphysical realism while recognizing the validity of the theory-laden notion of scientific, well, linguistic non-innocence of everything, right? To retain the aim of this. So, you know, thesis, antithesis, you know, if you want to think of it that way. Anyhow, so this just to plot that example onto this Rube Goldberg sort of thing. The Einsteinian physicist and the Newtonian physicist share many beliefs about what's out there. Among them is that what a planet is, and that's Mercury, what an orbit is, what the sun is. So this shared belief, what I call T sub m here, projects this sort of shared experience. So here's Mercury going. Now, each distinctive theory also projects its own distinctive representation, right? So Einstein's theory will project things such as space-time curvature, right? Newton's doesn't. However, if we can find logical implications from the projections that are different, right? Logical implications from the projections that are different for a projection that is shared. This allows us to use a shared sense of experience to be dispositive in determining which theory should capture our allegiance. So, for example, Einstein's theory says that Mercury's orbit should be anomalous, not anomalous. Mercury's orbit should be perturbed. That is, Mercury's orbit would not take the form that Newton's theory predicted it would. And then we sort of observe, and they both are observing the same thing. So presumably, when we see that Mercury's orbit doesn't follow the path that Newton's theory claimed, that not only would the Einsteinian, but also the Newtonian would have to say, all right, I agree, I, Newtonian, am wrong. So that's the idea. Next chapter, entitled are critical fusions toward a genuine hermeneutics of suspicion. I turn from the scientific to the practical ethical domain to demonstrate hermeneutics critical bona fides. In the terms of social and cultural understanding, I'm able to highlight not only the relevance of hermeneutic approaches, but also, when suitably modified, their perhaps unique suitability for projects of social and cultural critique. Now, given ongoing concern about questions of global justice, and in particular, the skepticism voiced by some post-colonialist and multiculturalist thinkers, that any ethical regime with cosmopolitan intentions must inevitably founder on the shoals of a Eurocentric ethnocentrism, I think hermeneutic approaches to social justice may be uniquely well-positioned simultaneously to do justice to cultural difference and to avoid situations where critique depends for its legitimacy on normative standards developed in and imposed by the so-called West. Not that West, but I highlight the conditions that allow for internal or imminent normative pressure to be brought to bear on social and cultural practices when they're hermeneutically understood. Among these conditions is the fact that, as is well known, cultures are not monolithic, homogeneous wholes. Every culture is a site of competing interpretive narratives. Additionally, I argue that cultural identity itself can be understood to be what I call a cluster concept, meaning that certain elements of the set of features that collectively constitute one's social identity may be revised as a result of critical reflection without resulting in the loss of that identity. I further developed my position here by proposing a conception of what I call second order rationality. And this is a mode of rationality that has a culturally invariant purchose. And I conclude the chapter by elaborating a new critical approach to cross-cultural understanding that is informed by what I call counterfactual dialogical critique. And that both second order rationality and this form of dialogical critique are tethered to the self-understanding of and possible acknowledgement by the to be understood agent or agents. I maintain that these conceptions of rationality, second order rationality, and of critique provide a more genuinely hermeneutic basis for what Paul Ricoeur has famously dubbed the hermeneutics of suspicion. That more hermeneutic than do the critical strategies of those whom Ricoeur cites as the masters of this suspicious interpretation, namely Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. Second order rationality refers to an inclination that we're entitled to impute to everyone to alter their ways when their own lack of rationality is pointed out to them in terms they can understand. This species of rationality, which can be deployed to critical effect, not only in scientific experimental design, but also in the interpretation of sacred texts, as well as in the interpretation of political constitutions, it has, I argue, a context invariant status. This conception of second order rationality further allows me to demonstrate that hermeneutic accounts of belief need not illegitimately conflate the appearance reality distinction. For without an appeal to anything beyond the standards of rationality and or the central vocabulary of any particular epistemic community, this conception allows us, nevertheless, to mark a distinction between what even everyone in such a community happens to think and what is reasonable for them to believe. That is, we can imagine in epistemic communities in which every member of that community believes something which is for them irrational. And I demonstrate that it is this context invariant form of rationality that hermeneutics can leverage in its application to the various kinds of differences and disagreements that I discuss throughout the book. On the third building block here, counterfactual dialogical critique. By that I refer to a conversational modality that can be triggered by an encounter with what appears prima facie to be a questionable social or cultural practice. For example, female genital cutting, even when it is pursued in cultural contexts where members of the affected group themselves seem to be part of the consensus in its favor. This critical modality is partially informed by the ideas that cultural identity should be conceived, as I said, as a cluster concept, and that cultures are sites of conflicting interpretations of what their identity-defining structures are. As a consequence, no single narrative purporting to capture definitively a culture's identity should be given carte blanche to function in such a way as to quarantine intracultural practices and to immunize them from critical scrutiny. In particular, I argue that we should be on the lookout for interpretations of cultural identity that, though they may claim to express a cultural self-understanding that everyone, if asked, would sign off on, one that is shared across gendered and social positioning, that such interpretations may actually operate instead as cloaks or ideological veils concealing invidiously strategic interests. My aim is to foreground and expose the contrast between such tendentious cultural readings that illegitimately reify cultural identity, and the possibility of more democratic forms of cultural interpretation that expand the scope of autonomous cultural agency. This way of proceeding allows me to give a non-foundationalist hermeneutical account of ideology and of ideology critique that avoids the standard epistemological criticisms of ideology and ideology critique and foreshadows my ultimate normative appeal to what I refer to as hermeneutic democracy, which is where I'll end up. The general idea here is that cultural agents can be invited to consider social possibilities that, while currently unrealized, might be preferred by them if given the option. Social possibilities whose realization is suppressed, not because such realization would offend against all intelligible interpretations of their cultural identity, but rather primarily because it would offend against those interpretations that underwrite particular vested interests. This would mean that even in the case of what is apparently a consensus about what the demands of cultural membership are, we could nevertheless hypothesize and subsequently confirm possibly suppressed interests of distinctive classes of cultural agents by conversationally generating and entertaining imagined social arrangements. As an illustration of the sorts of question that might, whether implicitly or explicitly, underlie such a dialogical engagement, also capture its critical intent and perhaps thereby prompt the processes of cultural self-reinterpretation that I spoke about earlier, I consider at some length the practice of female excision as practiced in parts of Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In many cases, women themselves seem to be party to the consensus authorizing the practice. The intuition that grounds the plausibility of my proposal was catalyzed by the following thought experiment. Imagine an encounter between a suspicious interlocutor, whether they share cultural membership with the affected women or not, that is one who fails to grasp the general acquiescence to the practice on the part of women to be fully intelligible. So imagine a conversation between such a suspicious interlocutor and one of these women. This interlocutor might, in appropriately safe spaces, initiate conversations of a particular sort with her, a particular woman, conversations oriented in terms of the following basic question. Armed with the knowledge of the all too likely physical and emotional consequences of the procedure, if the connection between undergoing this procedure or the procedure in its current form and your chances for flourishing in your society were virtualized, if that connection were virtualized, that is, if the connection between undergoing the procedure and flourishing in your society could be loosened or even severed, would you still choose to undergo the procedure? Would you still endorse the preference that you would otherwise have made? This is the sort of question that informs the conversational modality that I refer to as counterfactual dialogical critique. A modality that, if practiced within a society, suggests the plausibility of non-question begging, non-invidiously ethnocentric, critical perspectives on cultural practices that are not our own. In the case of excision, by generating and exploring culturally consistent alternatives to current practices, somewhat as if one were performing a Husserlian eidetic variation, right? Such dialogically executed explorations have as their aim finding culturally intelligible ways to prevent women from finding themselves in an unjust dilemma. Unjust in that it's one that they alone face, namely the dilemma of having to choose between having one's bodily integrity or facing social death. Now, this dialogical method of critique requires no imposition of an alien normative regime onto a given culture. And this allows me to split the difference, so to speak, between, and thereby partially to reconcile the emancipatory reflection championed by Habermas and others on the one hand, and a hermeneutically sensitive consciousness on the other. For the position that I developed does not require, as Gadamer occasionally falsely alleged against Habermas, that emancipatory reflection dissolves all of the structures of intelligibility intrinsic to the culture in question. Ultimately, this allows me to provide an account of a distinction that Gadamer famously invoked, but for which he failed to provide a fully satisfactory account, namely the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate prejudices, between legitimate hermeneutical prejudices and illegitimate hermeneutical prejudices. My account of this distinction invokes both the contested nature of cultural meaning, as well as the idea of the genuinely autonomous consent of the individuals in question. This, of course, will in turn require a non-question begging account of what I mean by autonomous agency. And it's an issue that I addressed in the book, but I won't take up here under the rubric of situated autonomous agency. Next chapter, entitled Agency, the Politics of Memory and Reparative Justice. Here, I concentrate on social agency by bringing into focus the phenomenon of agency itself, that is, the capacity to engage in effective action or to achieve preferred goals. This will turn out to have relevance for a broad range of issues that are pertinent to global and racial justice. My primary target in this chapter is a strand of thought that continues to maintain hegemony when these matters are debated, namely the view that the poverty and abjectness experienced by members of the underclass in so-called developed societies, and more broadly by society as a whole in so-called underdeveloped nations, is that poverty and abjectness is attributed to the social pathology of those populations, as opposed to being attributed to external social, economic, and political forces to which those populations are subject. This is roughly what in the sociological literature is known as the culture of poverty thesis. Basically, it's the claim that members of such societies are taken to suffer from an agency deficit, a view that is tantamount to holding them responsible for their own misery. I use the expression agency deficit as a portmanteau term to cover both cases of dysfunctional valuation and those that are characterized by a volitional deficit of some kind. Typically some species of weakness of will, acrasia, lack of discipline, self-control, and so on. There's already quite a substantial scholarly literature addressing the issue of this dysfunctional valuation. So in my book, I concentrate primarily on the second aspect of agential pathology. I'll call it the volitional deficit in terms of resources of willpower, right? I do so by offering a hermeneutic account of agency, an account that brings to light facets of this capacity, aspects of agency that would otherwise escape our notice. I show how this in turn allows us to diagnose a kind of epistemic injustice that may be implicated in assertions about the agential deficiencies of members of disadvantaged groups, as well as the injustice of withholding what I have called semantic authority from the sorts of interpretation of social experience that are requisite to the social agency of such persons. I think since I'll put up this next one. It's over here. Just, okay. Now, so this account of agency brings to the foreground and makes salient the discrepancy between, on the one hand, the historically sedimented conditions that continue to impede agency for some, and on the other hand, the enabling, but often hidden or unacknowledged conditions that facilitate agency for others. My claim is that drawing a distinction between two aspects or components of agency, between what I'm going to call first order agency and second order agency, and they're up there, allows us to highlight this discrepancy insofar as just such a distinction between first and second order components of agency. It disaggregates, it separates two aspects of agency, namely the volitional component and the epistemic component. So first order agency refers roughly to, as I said, to volitional resources, to willpower, discipline, and so on. By second order agency, I refer to the ability to envision how the achievement of a desired end or outcome is a real possibility, or to the capacity to find reasons for the expectation that one's efforts will pay off. To illustrate this distinction briefly, I turn to an example of John Locke's, where I have in mind the situation of a person who's put into a prison cell and is led to believe falsely, right, that all the doors are locked. Now, this person is objectively able to leave the cell because the doors aren't locked. Okay? He's objectively able to leave the cell, but because given the information available to him, he cannot intelligibly avail himself of this opportunity, his ability to do that is compromised. To the extent that the second order capacity to have reason to expect that his efforts to walk out would pay off was compromised, because as far as he knew it was locked, he would not be in a position to exercise his first order capacity to leave the cell. One might say that he would be imprisoned by his belief that the door is locked rather than by the actual locked door. Now, second order agency can be systematically undermined for some agents due to wholly contingent structural features of society that are beyond their control. So in order to establish a baseline in terms of which we can consistently distinguish between a failure to flourish that represents a culpable volitional deficit for which we blame someone on the one hand, and a failure for which the agent does not bear responsibility on the other, I suggest that we take into consideration the set of, these are a set of conditions that I take to be my baseline, that we take into consideration the set of recognitional, epistemic, social, and material conditions that are generally necessary and jointly sufficient for the exercise of agency in a given society. I stipulate that these be understood to be the normal conditions for that society. That's down here. Now, these normal conditions are often unacknowledged and taken for granted. Okay? These conditions that facilitate agency. For the majority of individuals in such a society, the relative invisibility of these normal conditions and the relative effortless exercise of second order agency for them leads such privileged individuals to believe that their success is their own doing, is a product of their efforts alone. It's a person who's born on third base but claims to have hit a triple, right? Is a product of their efforts alone. And further, it leads them to view the failure of others to rest on the shoulders of those others alone. In other words, the privileged individuals will say, well, I did it by myself without a handout, why can't you? Now, indeed, one of the correlates of social privilege is precisely such a hermeneutic blindness or obliviousness to the role of normal conditions, and for that matter, to the requirements of second order agency. This is a too often hidden structural component of inequality. Only if, for a given individual or group, such normal conditions have been satisfied, would we be justified in pinning their failure to flourish at their door. Otherwise, it could well be the case that an individual is fully willing and has the requisite first order reserves of discipline and tenacity, but will have had their capacity to envision success as a real possibility compromised. Here, I think of children living in poverty who may well be fully willing to apply themselves to their studies, but who are unaware of and or unable to avail themselves of the requisite quiet spaces, who are unable to envision access to such quiet spaces as a real possibility. So I argue that if persons who suffer under current conditions appear through their actions or inaction to be culpable for their own suffering, we need to heed the aforementioned distinctions, for it may be the case that we do not yet truly understand their choices. To understand a person's choices will require that we engage in a hermeneutical investigation undertaken under what I call the constraint of narrative representability. Narrative representability. Narrative representability refers to an agent's ability to plot a continuous, connected, credible trajectory originating in their current concrete conditions and current conception of socially available options, and terminating in some preferred outcome or state that is viewed as a real possibility. That is, we must ask, how do things appear from the first person perspective within which these choices were made? Understanding such choices in this manner can bring into focus cases where the agent making the choices may not be culpable for their failure to make life-enhancing choices. Well, they may be, but they may not be. We can't tell unless we perform the hermeneutical investigation. And if they're not, then this may indeed be a case where an injustice of an epistemic sort will have been committed against them. By an injustice of an epistemic sort, I refer to the injustice of failing to acknowledge the agent's epistemic state when that state or the structural conditions responsible for it, through no fault of their own, unfairly compromise the agent's ability to act. And this turns out to be the compound injustice of having one's agency compromised by an epistemic limitation for which one bears no culpability, and of nevertheless being judged or blamed for that lack of agency. A hermeneutic lens is necessary for the detection of these injustices and therefore to underwrite the critical social interventions that would address them. Though I do not discuss these issues in this brief summary, referring now to the last two chapters I discussed, in their explorations of different facets of hermeneutics relevance for social cultural analysis, those last two chapters are bound by two central hinges. Insofar as the mechanism of counterfactual dialogical critique outlined in the second chapter can foreground the ideological nature of particular cultural interpretations, we can view it as addressing an epistemic condition of agency that sheds light on what's referred to in the feminist literature as a phenomenon of adaptive preference. That is, a preference that is adapted to a context in which the agent cannot envision how the achievement of an otherwise preferred or non-adaptive preference is a real possibility. Second, in the just discussed the third chapter on agency, I developed further the idea of the importance to social agency of achieving semantic authority for agency-enabling interpretations of social experience. Semantic authority refers to the hermeneutic capacity to name aspects of one's experience that demand to be addressed. Examples of what the achievement of semantic authority would amount to can be given by thinking about the notion of police brutality or the notion of sexual harassment. These were, in a way, descriptions of social reality that, in a sense, had to be fought for. And there are obvious examples of concepts whose semantic authorization is crucial to our current moment. And that's why I mentioned recognitional. That's why the recognitional comes in here. That's to say, one must be count on being one's perception of reality must count that on the fact that one's perception of reality will be taken seriously as a candidate for a description of reality. That's roughly the idea. Now, my last major discussion occurs in the next chapter. That should be entitled Toward Hermeneutics of Race, Biology, Race, Ethnicity, and Culture, where I deploy a hermeneutic lens to interrogate racial discourse, racial classification, and the social practices associated with them. Here, drawing on both my earlier discussion, the first chapter in the status of natural kinds in the natural sciences, and the so-called new genomic-based biology of race, I revisit the question of whether the practice of segmenting humanity into what are ordinarily understood as races has any biological justification. This will allow me to lay bare the role of hermeneutic interpretation in ordinary racial classification, and thereby to highlight the social strategies that are enacted in practices of racial classification. As I've indicated, the hermeneutic account of meaning, of the meaning of the natural kind terms, challenges the idea that such terms can be unproblematically mapped onto an independently existing determinate reality. My discussion of the ontological status of racial categories is pursued both in light of that account and within the context of recent work in population genetics, genomics, and evolutionary medicine, research that has led to the so-called new biology of race. Given my account of natural kind terms, I argue that a fortiori, conventional racial categories cannot be understood to be isomorphic to what Plato and the Phaedrus physicist referred to as nature's joints. For we know the phenotypic traits conventionally used to demarcate races neither have intrinsic biological significance nor been shown to correlate with characteristics of intrinsic significance. And further, that intra-racial diversity within so-called racial groups is far more pronounced than is between racial groups, that far more pronounced than is interracial racial diversity. Now, recent developments in the fields of population genetics and genomics, this is study of the human genome, have led some scholars to question this putative consensus that there is no biological basis for what is ordinarily understood as a division of our species along racial lines. Since the sequencing of the human genome in 2003, new techniques have enabled the identification of what are known as intraspecies population structures. That is, biogenetically significant partitions of our species based upon what is known as genetic clustering. Groupings wherein the genetic distance between pairs of individuals within a group is less than the genetic distance between groups. Computer programs have been developed that when operating on genetic information drawn from a worldwide and putatively representative sample of humanity, yield the clusters, genetic clusters that span our species. The number of such clusters, the number of such partitions into which the human genetic material is to be distributed is determined not, however, by the algorithm itself, but it's determined by the programmers, by the human programmers. It turns out that when the number of clusters, the number of partitions is set to 5, and they use the letter K to indicate the number of clusters. So when K is set to 5, the resultant genetic partitions closely match continental population groups. The genetic partitions closely match the following continental population groups: Sub-Saharan Africa, Eurasia, which includes Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central and South Asia, 2nd, East Asia, 3rd, Oceania, 4th, and America, 5. So those population groups match the clusters if we set K to 5. Now, this seems to fairly neatly coincide with conventional racial categories based on observable or phenotypical features, to wit, Black, white, Asian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian, respectively. And as I've indicated, some scholars think this vindicates ordinary racial taxonomy and have seized upon it to bolster a new case for the biological reality of race as ordinarily understood. Now, I prosecute basically 2 arguments against this view. First, the 2 classification regimes, ordinary racial taxonomy and that based on genetic clusters, do not correlate meaningfully at all. It turns out that one cannot establish an isomorphic mapping from one to the other. That is, there's a significant disconnect or mismatch between these 2 modes of classification. Second, genetic variation from human group to human group occurs on a continuum. It varies linearly and gradually with geographic distance, changing smoothly across geographic regions with very few sharp breaks. Now, establishing partitions among continuously varying parameters that fail to manifest themselves as being already or intrinsically sort of nicely organized with fence posts around them that our concepts must respect. Establishing partitions among such continuously varying parameters requires that somehow we project or impose upon them metrics of similarity and difference. That is, say, it's not in a sense there, it's not part of nature's joints, but we have to project on them these metrics of similarity and difference. And this is precisely what happens when the researchers, not nature herself, determine the number of distinct genetic clusters into which humanity is to be subdivided. So in this sense, I argue, genetically determined human population structures are themselves best understood as being interpretive products. So even though the concepts of population structure and genetic clustering refer to biologically real phenomena, don't question that, even they cannot claim to carve nature at her joints. Moreover, what is scientifically useful in this populationist concept has very little to do with our ordinary conception of race. And since I showed that the latter, our ordinary racial categories, in themselves have virtually no predictive or explanatory significance, their status is doubly artifactual. To this extent, their employment betrays a social interest that is susceptible to rational critique. Just one more page. In characterizing racial categories in this way, and in maintaining that there's no biologically meaningful referent of such categories, I'm not, as some others do, claiming that race is a fiction. I'm not claiming that race is a fiction, that there's nothing that racial discourse is about. However, since any pretense that racial distinction serves scientific purposes is demonstrably ideological or false, I maintain that we need to look elsewhere to locate the interests that undergird such classification regimes, and to determine what those regimes are about. I conclude here that race is a category of social recognition, and as such, it is a social kind, not a natural kind. And when we understand it to refer to social kinds, we are in a position to appreciate how racial classification not only plays its obvious nefarious role in sustaining the status quo ante in racially stratified societies, but also how it can be pressed into strategic emancipatory service against such social orders. So I include in the final chapter, entitled Toward a New Reconciliation, Hermeneutics and Critical Theory, or Notes Toward a Hermeneutic Democracy. I conclude with a recapitulation of the implications of my argument for our understanding of the scope and critical diagnostic significance of hermeneutics, and an account of the relationship of my project to the tradition of critical theory. I do the latter by making explicit the normative commitments of my project and show how that allows me to position critical hermeneutics as a continuation of the project of critical theory by other means. I show how social legitimacy and social self-understanding are coupled. One of the fundamental ways in which illegitimate social power manifests itself is in the strategic promulgation and policing of the semantic resources available for cultural interpretation and self-understanding. Accordingly, I maintain that a fully legitimate social-cultural self-understanding on the part of a society is one that is, first, sufficiently reflexive to permit an acknowledgement of its own inadequacy in providing the semantic resources requisite for the agency of all of its members, and two, is sufficiently hermeneutically charitable to acknowledge the various horizons of intelligibility from which its constituent stakeholders speak and act, horizons that provide the conditions that facilitate or impede agency. Now, of course, this expresses a counterfactual. No existing society is fully legitimate in this sense. Legitimacy is an unfinished project. But these conditions inform the criteria for the critique of existing arrangements. A flawed self-understanding on the part of a society, one that fails to meet these two conditions, is at risk of becoming the sort of reified ideological cultural interpretation that I discussed earlier, one that justifies such practices as female excision and requires so-called adaptive preferences on the part of deprived women, one that underpins the misdiagnoses and epistemic epidemic of epistemic injustice, misdiagnoses and epistemic injustices that follow from the fallacy of assigning responsibility for the plight of the poor to their own deficits of agency. And one that in general fails to acknowledge the legitimate claims of those who, from the margins of society, struggle to have their perception of society and of themselves acknowledged. The antidote to such arbitrary restrictions on the interpretive agency of individuals and social groups is what I call hermeneutic or semantic democracy. Semantic democracy, where competing social interpretations can be granted public recognition, is a prerequisite of generalized social agency. Such a democratization of interpretive or hermeneutic agency requires that there be no arbitrary restrictions to participation in the interpretive practices that generate collectively binding and enabling social meanings. In this way, social legitimacy can be seen to require hermeneutic democracy. Thank you for your time.